I think Loki episode 2 just introduced the rebirth of the multiverse, so we have a lot to discuss in this week's episode. Let's get right to it. Hey guys, it's Sean O'Connell, the managing editor here at CinemaBlend, and we are continuing to break down Loki, the new show on Disney+. We are 2 episodes into it, and we learned a ton of things in this week's episode, including who is the variant, and what did that variant just do. So we're going to dive into all of the expert analysis and explanation as to what we think is going on.
But you already knew that.
Needless to say, we're going to be getting into a ton of different spoilers for episodes 1 and 2 of Loki. So, without further ado, let's dive right into our first topic.
I'm excited. I'm chomping at the bit.
Okay, so let's get to the big reveal at the end of the episode, the identity of the variant. And we've been told that the TVA believed that the hooded variant was essentially Loki, and what it turned out to be is Lady Loki.
Very clever.
I know.
Some people have been speculating that it could also be a character called the Enchantress, who is a big character from Asgard and is both a rival to Thor and Loki, but also an ally sometimes. And Lady Loki herself in the Marvel Comics ends up becoming a variant, or someone who's at least based on Enchantress. So I think it's very possible that this new character who we're being introduced to might be an amalgamation of the two. But I think for various reasons it is definitely being played off as Lady Loki because, first off, it's the costume. I mean, she essentially looks like she's wearing, with the headpiece and the area around her neck, like it looks like a Loki costume. And, you know, when her essence is sort of passed off to another person, she bristles at being called Loki.
Don't call me that.
And she also does something very specific that Mobius brings up earlier in the episode.
The variant likes to stall for time, and eventually we'll catch the other one doing the same thing.
Thank you for helping me stall for time.
There it is.
Part of the reason why I also think that this is Lady Loki over the Enchantress is the origin of Lady Loki in the comics. Now, essentially, after Ragnarok, Loki's essence, or the essence of most of the people in Asgard, head down to Earth and assume the bodies of other people, random people, and their essence essentially is transitioned into different bodies. And that allowed Loki in the comics to bounce from person to person, and Loki's essence stayed inside the body of a female for a long period of time and had different impacts on characters like Jane Foster and Thor to a certain extent. So the way that the essence is being passed around the people also suggests to me that that is Lady Loki. But where did they go? Like, that's a great question. I'm not quite sure where they're going. Of course, we all knew Loki was going to step through that doorway. And, it, you know, sets up a great question for where we're going in episode 3 right off the bat.
This isn't about you.
Right.
Okay, so let's dive into what Lady Loki did. Now, the last 3 minutes of this episode, I think, are extremely significant if it plays out the way that I'm kind of imagining. So we knew that the variant had been going through the sacred timeline and collecting these time restoration capsules, or time bombs, as somebody in the comments on episode 1 video called them. I think that that's a pretty great description for them. So Lady Loki has spread them all around Roxxon in 2050 and triggered them all at the same time. After she told Loki that, hey, this whole scheme that you think you've been tracking is not about you. So she clearly has another goal in mind. Now, what that did was that it created multiple Nexus events off of the sacred timeline. More Nexus events than the TVA, you'd assume, would be able to handle. As we learned in this week's episode, obviously there's a bit of dialogue that explains what happens if those threads pass the red line.
The TVA can no longer reset a Nexus event.
And that would lead to the destruction of the timeline and the collapse of reality as we know it.
I think that that's essentially going to be the rebirth of the multiverse. Like, this will explain how if the sacred timeline was created following a multiversal war where all these different multiverses competed against each other, and it was up to the timekeepers to pull them all together and to create one, then if Lady Loki is able to get some of those branches beyond the red line and it leads to the decimation of the sacred timeline, you'll go back to that multiversal existence where there's different threads and different multiverses competing against each other, and allows Marvel then to potentially have different realities playing off of each other. So I really do think, maybe it won't pay off in the next episode, but I guarantee you those last 3 minutes of Lady Loki setting off all of those capsules and creating all those different Nexus events, I think that's going to lead to the destruction of the sacred timeline, which in turn will lead to the existence of multiverses.
It'll be fun, though.
Yeah. It'd be really fun.
Okay, so the big reveals were about who the variant is, but that doesn't mean that episode 2 wasn't chock full of a lot of other questions that are being brought up and a few other things that we learned. One thing that I sort of attached onto is that Mobius, played by Owen Wilson, has never met the Timekeepers. Building off of something that I said in the analysis to episode 1, I think the Timekeepers are like a Wizard of Oz type hoax. Like, I don't think that there's anyone behind the curtain. I don't think that there are actually 3 Timekeepers. I think they're fake, and I think it's kind of like an empty threat, like a myth that their existence keeps the TVA moving along. And that would just feed very much into a series based on Loki, where he relies on illusion and misdirection to keep people looking in a different direction. And the conversation in this one that tipped me off to the fact that Mobius might be catching on to this is when he sat down with the judge.
And how are the old timekeepers?
That little piece of dialogue led me to believe that he's also starting to question their existence. But then something happens later with the TVA agent who gets possessed by Loki and taken from the Renaissance Fair into the Roxxon location of 2050, where she's reciting over and over again,
I gave it away how to find them.
So I'm still chewing over that. Like, I don't quite know why that is a sense of urgency. It creates a sense of urgency with the fact that she feels bad that she revealed where they are, but I think I still think that that's just be like a reveal of the fact that they are not who we believe them to be. And if I'm correct, like that they don't exist in the form that the TVA is setting them up to exist in. So put a pin in the discussion about the Timekeepers, but I'm starting to believe that Owen Wilson's character Mobius is getting a lot closer to figuring out that the people who he works for are not exactly people.
Magic lizards.
There'll be an explanation for who the Timekeepers are, but I don't think it's the one that we've been given so far in the TVA.
Fair enough.
Now, that also raises the question of how much knowledge Lady Loki might have about the TVA and the Timekeepers, and if her goal ultimately is to bring it down. I don't know about that 100%, because Loki in general, and if Lady Loki is kind of like a mirror image of Loki, he's pretty self-serving, and most of the things that he's trying to do are for him, essentially. And so when she says to Loki, like, this isn't about you, that could really mean that it's just, she has a goal in mind, and nobody's going to really stop her from accomplishing it. One of the reasons why I don't think that her ultimate goal is tied 100% to the TVA, or maybe even the Timekeepers, is because Loki basically pitches her like, hey, my end game here is to get in front of the Timekeepers and to take them down. Why don't you work with me, to do that?
What say you?
After 8 to 10 seconds of consideration, the answer is no. I'm not interested in ruling the Time Variance Authority.
She might want to restore the existence of the multiverses because she's from one of them and is trying to get back to them, or needs to get somebody out of one of those multiverses, because at one point throughout the course of this episode we do see these various interpretations of Loki who I'm assuming are from other multiverses, different multiverses, and I'm sure Lady Loki is either trying to get back to one of those multiverses or get somebody from them to come back to her. So we're speculating pretty far ahead, but if those end up being true, then good for me that I pegged it right now.
I love to be right.
One of the other cool things that we learned is that a variant can move around the timeline and create havoc without really raising the variant's energies and not create a branch off the timeline if they go back to a time where there's a natural disaster.
Nothing matters!
It's pretty cool that in a Marvel show that we get to go back to Pompeii in 79 AD, and that Loki's able to do whatever he wants to because it won't have an effect on the ultimate timeline. I thought that was a really good explanation by Marvel to talk about how the variant or Lady Loki was able to move around the timeline without creating any kind of implications. Now, then we would start to look ahead and ask what things happened on the Marvel Cinematic Universe timeline that a variant could return back to and not have an impact. And I don't quite know, because I'm hung up on one main thing about the creation of this show, which is the TVA tells Loki that the Avengers were supposed to go back through time. But what wasn't supposed to happen was that he was not supposed to pick up the Tesseract and disappear, which leads to the creation of this show. But if you take that conversation one step further, and we're in Avengers Endgame, then one other thing happens as a result of Loki leaving with the Tesseract that probably wasn't supposed to happen, and that's Steve and Tony go back to 1970, essentially, to New Jersey 1970, because they have to get a Tesseract. So ultimately, the Avengers need to get a Tesseract. They weren't able to get the one from 2012 because Loki took it, but they went back and they found another one in 1970. Now, over the course of that time, Steve interacts with Peggy, who might have been spotted in the background of episode 1, although I think Marvel's coming out and saying that's not Peggy Carter. Steve also interacts with, and this is significant, Hank Pym. Calls him away from his office at one point so that he can go in there and get Pym particles. But maybe him pulling Hank Pym away from his research at that point leads to a little ripple. And Tony, of course, he interacts with his father, which could change who Howard Stark is on the timeline. Like, I think that trip to 1970s New Jersey is really significant because, much like Loki wasn't supposed to disappear from the lobby of Stark Tower with the Tesseract, Tony and Steve were not supposed to go back to 1970 at all. Even though that's where they got the Tesseract from and they were able to bring it back to present day, them going to that time and interacting with the people that they did, I think, is very, very deliberate. And we might see, maybe not in Loki, but maybe in something else that's coming out down the line, you might find out how that scene, as a ramification of Loki disappearing, has greater impact on the MCU moving forward.
How does it all end?
That's a work in progress.
Oh, those lazy timekeepers. What are they waiting for?
Let's wrap up this week's episode, episode 2, The Variant. We have learned that Lady Loki is the one who's pulling the strings. She's now paired with Loki as they disappeared, and, I think ultimately Loki was working against the TVA to try to figure out a way to get some face time with the timekeepers. But now I kind of feel like he might be improvising. He and she might be improvising as a reluctant pair together, but what they're trying to accomplish, I'm not quite sure. We'll find out if the last 3 minutes of this episode were as significant to the MCU as I think they're going to be, whether that leads to the destruction of the sacred timeline and the creation of, or the restoration of the existence of the multiverse. Also, there's no better song to set a fight sequence to than I Need a Hero. It just works.
A reasonable man cannot differ.
We will be back here on the YouTube channel talking about episode 3. We'll be at the halfway point by next week's episode, which is kind of strange because these are longer episodes but a shorter season, and we'll continue to see what kind of implications the series of Loki has on the MCU in general.
Bye.